Hello and welcome to Conversations in Culture and Evolution. I am your host, Carles Salazar. I am talking to you from Lleida in Catalonia. Conversations in Culture and Evolution is a product of a work group of the Catalan Institute of Anthropology that goes by the name of Culture, Cognition and Evolution. And in this work group, we are some anthropologists and archaeologists unhappy with the way in which our disciplines were treating Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection and the relationship between biology and culture in the explanation of human behavior. And in order to compensate for this deficiency, we have created this group. Now, today, we have a very special guest today. Today, our guest is Professor Ruth Mace from University College London. Hello, Ruth.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
Welcome to Conversations in Culture and Evolution. Now, Ruth Mace is an evolutionary anthropologist known for pioneering the application of evolutionary theory to human behavior, cultural diversity, and demographic change. Her research has advanced our understanding of how ecological and social factors shape human life history and cultural evolution, leading to some key papers on the evolution of menopause, fertility transitions, and kinship systems. Her work is characterized by innovative methodological approaches and includes demographic fieldwork in various countries in Africa, in China, and recently in Kyrgyzstan and in Mexico. She often focuses on evolutionary modeling and testing these models empirically. She was one of the first to propose with Marc Pagel and use cross-cultural phylogenetic comparative analysis in anthropology. And she has supervised more than 25 PhD students, and she has led several large research projects in human behavioral ecology, cultural evolution, and human evolutionary demography, including 2 ERC advanced grants. Right. And now let me show you some of the books that she has edited. I don't know whether you can see, I think you can see them. These are 2 books. The first is Substitute Parents, Biological and Social Perspectives on Alloparenting in Human Societies. And this one has been edited together with Gillian Bitley. And The Evolution of Cultural Diversity, a Phylogenetic Approach, edited together with Claire Holden and Stephen Sheener. Right. Now, Ruth, let me ask you the question that we ask all our guests. In what way has Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection been relevant to your research? And in what way do you think is relevant to understand human beings?
Well, I mean, throughout my academic career, really, I've been studying the evolutionary and ecological origins of behavior. And I actually trained as a zoologist, and I was working on animal behavior originally for my PhD. And then I was always interested in human behavior, and I think I became very well aware that some of the models that we were using to model animal behavior could also help us understand human behavior. So I started, right after my PhD, I got postdoctoral money and to work on decision-making and reproductive decision-making in human beings. And originally I was actually working with Gabra pastoralists in northern Kenya, and that was where I did my first kind of anthropological field work a very long time ago. Yes. So it's always been completely fundamental to the approach that I've been taking, I would say, right from the beginning. Yeah.
Right. Now, social anthropologists sometimes are kind of reluctant to accept evolutionary approaches. And how would you respond to this criticism?
think they're the last bastion. I think even the Pope believes in evolution these days. I think everyone believes in evolution, and for some reason, social anthropology is holding out against it. So maybe you have to ask them why. But I think it's partly become, I mean, it's a little bit, I think that most social anthropologists are not using a scientific approach, so it's not just a theory of evolution. They're not interested in testing hypotheses, so why would they be interested in a framework that is very powerful for testing hypotheses? And more than that, I think it's almost become, I mean, you know, people in the street understand evolution. Our students who go on to study anthropology understand evolution perfectly well. But then somehow in professional social anthropology, there seems to be a resistance. I think it's almost a badge of honor or a sort of entry ticket into the thought processes or something. I actually think it's a cultural identity marker these days, rather than a serious. I can't really answer that question, because I think we just decided to get on with our work, and that's what we do. And I think my colleagues in social anthropology are often just interested in other things, and they've got some misunderstandings about the field that are perpetuated in the field for whatever reason.
That's right. I remember once I was teaching PhD students in Barcelona in social anthropology, and I was proposing evolutionary approach, and they were all, reluctant to accept that. And I said, well, what are you? If you're not evolutionist, are you a creationist then? Because it seemed to me that how can you approach?
That's almost the only other option,
How can you approach a study of any living organisms? You don't use an evolutionary approach. Now, as you just said, you have this background in zoology, and then you move to anthropology. From your background, how would you define the human species? What do you think what makes us humans different from other species? What would be, in your view, a characteristic that is shared by all humans, but is a specific of humans? Would that be culture? Would that be language? I don't know, intelligence?
Well, I think there's so many things. I mean, we were just one of the hominids that has this massive brain that is capable of doing all these things: language, culture, tool, everything. I mean, there's so many things. Even our life history is different. I mean, there's no shortage of characteristics which make us completely different from our closest relatives. I mean, obviously, our closest relative was probably the Neanderthals that there's a lot of debate about how much they knew, but I think we were pretty different. But I'm not too bothered. I mean, a general definition of species I'm normally quite happy with is just barriers to interbreeding. And obviously we did have some interbreeding with Neanderthals, but it wasn't the norm. I mean, our genomes are clearly different. So even though obviously we know there was some interbreeding, but yeah, I'm not sure that we need a particular definition. Yeah. But I mean, clearly we're better at all those things than any other living species by a considerable margin. So species definitions are a bit complicated, but
that's right.
I don't think we really need one in a way, because we're so different from everything else that's alive. There's not really any difficulty there. If you're looking at an archaeological record, then you have a problem, but then you don't have all the behavioral information, so you don't know exactly when. But that's true with any species you look at, when you've got change over time, it's very hard to say, and maybe not even necessary to say exactly when something happened.
That's right. But if you compare, for instance, research that we do in anthropology with primatologists who study the non-human primates, I mean, many of the things that we normally would consider specific of humans, such as language and culture, then primatologist comes along and says, no, primates also have a kind of language. and they also have a kind of culture.
Well, yeah, I mean, some of them do. I mean, they don't have spoken language, but, well, they won't. I mean, yeah, no, these things might be a matter of degree. But I don't really, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that we've taken these, and then quite apart from anything else, we've evolved this massive chunk of brain on top of our head that they don't have. And, you know, we are much more capable of far more advanced linguistic and conceptual thought and all sorts of things, really. So I'm not saying there's no culture in animals. I mean, there's definitely cultural learning in all sorts of things. I think there was a paper recently showing cultural learning in tortoises or something. So it's, you know, I'm not saying cultural transmission is unique to humans, but I think we do something at a much higher level.
That's right. That's right. What about human nature? Some people say, again, social anthropologists sometimes are reluctant to accept that there is such a thing as human nature. Some people talk about human natures in plural, as there were more than one human nature. What would be your take on that?
Well, we obviously don't behave like chimpanzees, so obviously, yes. There obviously is human nature, and I don't know how Australopithecines behave, but we obviously, given the size of their brain, I'm pretty sure we don't behave like them. So on that kind of level, obviously there is a human nature that's different from all those other species. If you mean, well, yes, at that level, I would say obviously there's human nature. If you're talking about variability in behavior, then that's a whole different thing. And obviously we're you know, we have different personalities and all that sort of thing. That's for sure. Yeah.
Right. Because the concept of human nature in the plural, I think it's a bit dangerous, isn't it? Because it reminds me of some kind of racism. I mean, some people have different nature.
Yeah, I don't think. You don't want to. Yeah, I don't think people. Some people have argued that different individuals have different personalities.
Right. Yeah.
I don't. The fact that, and obviously different groups behave differently, but the fact that you behave differently doesn't really tell you anything about any sort of. I would try and, I'm a behavioral ecologist, so I interpret behavioral differences as different responses to your ecological environment. So the behavioral ecology approach basically assumes that you have some kind of underlying motivation to survive, to reproduce, etc. And we're just very good at, as is any living species, trying to implement that in different ways, in the different conditions that we find ourselves. So I don't think there's, there's no evidence. There's not much evidence that there's going to be. We're pretty flexible. You move people around, and they adopt the behaviour of wherever they go. But I think the nature-nurture question is a bit old-fashioned. I don't think we really. I don't think we really focus on that anymore very much. People were obsessed with it in the 1950s. Animal behaviorists were trying to work out what was instinct and what was whatever. And it wasn't a very useful way of doing science, I don't think. And, people like Konrad Lorenz were getting geese to imprint on them and all that sort of stuff. And then Tinbergen came along and various others, and they sort of said, well, that's just one way of looking at behavior, and it's sort of much more interesting to look at evolutionary function and things like that. And then, behavioral ecology was born out of that. And I think all that nature-nurture stuff went away a bit, and behavioral ecology took off. And then I guess there's been a sort of a slight re-emergence of it all with behavioral genetics and GWAS and that sort of thing. But they're still just discovering that it's incredibly complicated. And very difficult to tie. I mean, never say never, but I think the idea of, that complex behaviors are going to be tied down to any particular gene is long. It's sort of ancient history, really. And I don't think, behavioral genetics is still going strong in some places, but on the whole, I think the whole nature-nurture question has just kind of, the answer is everything's both, and it's very complicated, and we're certainly never going to find very simple links between genes and behavior for most complex behaviors that we're interested in. So I'm not sure that this, I don't think there aren't that many scientists working on that anymore. It seems to me like that's a preoccupation of a previous era, really. I don't think I don't think that's, certainly as a behavioral ecologist, we are notoriously black box about such things. We don't really, Tim Bergen's big contribution was he made a distinction between these four different, he made many contributions, but he was an behaviorist. He didn't work on humans much until kind of in his retirement, really. But, his four questions were that we should make, and Ernst Mayr as well, talking about the distinction between proximate and ultimate explanations of behavior. So proximate mechanisms are things like your genetics, is it nature, nurture, whatever. And then ultimate are like the evolutionary costs and benefits. And then Tim Bergen had a slightly more refined version where he divided the kind of evolutionary bit into the evolutionary history and the evolutionary function. And I think that's where there's been big strides and a lot of new stuff going on in the kind of 50 years or so since he wrote that paper. Well, it was even longer ago than that. He wrote it in the 1960s, I think. So, I think keeping that distinction in mind is really important, and it completely brushes away all these confusions that a lot of people and a lot of social anthropologists have about evolutionary approaches to behavior, because I don't know. You can answer a question in many different ways. You can say, oh, there's a gene for that, or you can say, there's a functional interpretation of lactose tolerance, which is that you drink milk in this environment, and it's useful to drink milk because you keep cattle, and that's, one's functional, one's based on a gene, and they're both right. They're not they're not competing explanations, and I think there's just a lot of confusion.
That's right.
Psychologists are interested in proximate mechanisms a great deal. A lot of cultural evolution people are interested in cultural transmission. I would call that a proximate mechanism. And then the behavioral ecologists and evolutionary anthropologists are more interested in, okay, what are the functional costs? Why did this evolve? What are the costs and benefits that have driven this behavior to persist in this place and not in that place over there? So they're just different ways of looking at it. And I don't think those of us who are interested in functional stuff have sort of not really thought about nature nurture for a long time. It doesn't really mean very much. Right,
yeah. Well, sometimes when I look at the history of social anthropology, and I see, for instance, work done in the 1950s and 60s, and they were very, the approach was totally independent from any reference to the biological nature of human beings. And I can understand that to some extent, because at that time, there was very little known about biologists overwhelmingly were studying non-human animals. And when it comes to humans, they say, no, biology has nothing to do with humans. Humans is just culture, and that's it. But that's no longer the case. Now we see that the biological study of human beings has advanced an awful lot. And it seems to me that we cannot be ignorant of this.
No. I mean, obviously that's true, but I also think that if you're interested in behavior, if you're interested in human behavior, you're obviously interested in culture, because our behavior is hugely cultural. Well, it depends what you mean by cultural, but obviously culture's huge. I mean, it has a huge impact, and it's true. And if you say, why is that person? Why does that society marry monogamously and that society allow you to marry polygamously? I mean, that's a cultural difference. But that doesn't mean to say, and maybe if you're a social anthropologist, that's the end of the story, and you can just close the book then and say, oh, okay, I've explained it, it's just a cultural difference. But if you're a behavioral ecologist, yeah, of course it's a cultural difference. I'm not going to argue with you about that, but I don't find that a very satisfying answer. You can answer anything. There's no subject left if that's all you're going to say. And that, why is that culture different from that culture, is an interesting question. And the way a behavioral ecologist like me or an evolution anthropologist like me might try and answer that is to say, well, is there something about the ecology in which those people live,
right,
that means that those that chose to marry monogamously survived and reproduced better than those that chose to marry polygamously? And therefore that might explain why this lot are mostly marrying monogamously and that lot are mostly marrying polygamously. And it doesn't mean to say it's not a cultural difference. It is a cultural difference if that's one culture and that's another culture. But that's just, where did that cultural difference come from? That to me is the interesting bit about cultural evolution. And behavioral ecology is a tool that, because we answer that question in birds, we answer it in red deer. There's red deer on run, highly polygamous. Red deer in Spain wander around in couples. Why? And so that's a question that you can apply behavioral ecology to, and
right.
That's what the evolutionary anthropologists are trying to do. So I don't think we need to have a fight. I will grant you that it is a cultural difference, but I want to know where that cultural difference is coming from.
That's right. You define yourself as behavioral ecologist. I mean, tell us what would be the specific contribution of behavioral ecology in comparison with other evolutionary approaches, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, well, some people call themselves evolutionary ecologists. Some people call themselves evolutionary anthropologists if they're studying human behavioral ecology. I don't think we've done our PR very well. I think it's a bit of a mouthful and nobody really knows what you mean when you say behavioral ecology, but it really is just the study of, can we understand behavior as something that's adapted to its ecology? How does ecology shape behavior? What is the evolutionary and ecological basis of behavior? And I think if you say something like cultural evolution, it's just much easier. It slips off the tongue easily. Everyone goes very excited, and then the social anthropologists don't get annoyed because it has the word cultural in it, and so they don't start telling you you're a fascist or something. And then it all just kind of works better. But I mean, to me, the best way of studying cultural evolution is to use the tools of behavioral ecology. It's just, I don't think we had the right word or something. I don't know what it is, but there's a lot of different words which kind of go in and out of fashion. I think probably evolutionary anthropologist, evolutionary demographer is another label that comes up. I mean, they're all basically doing the same thing. They're asking questions about the evolutionary and ecological basis of human behavior. And I think a lot of cultural evolution people and a lot of evolutionary psychologists and whatever are all trying to do the same thing, but they may have come at it through a different route, not necessarily through behavioral ecology, but they often end up in behavioral ecology whether they realize it or not. Yeah.
Because behavioral ecology, first, it was an approach to study behavior in non-human animals.
It grew out of ethology, I guess.
Right.
I mean, it was kind of popped up really in the early 1970s. People studying bird behavior. Tinbergen was an ornithologist studying bird behavior, and Yeah, I mean, it is, but I think it has been applied very successfully to trying to understand human diversity, basically. I mean, it's a tool to understand why this group behave differently from that group, or why these individuals within this population behave differently from those individuals. So it explains diversity both at the individual level and possibly also at the sort of ecological level. So it's very, very flexible. Yeah, so I don't really see, I mean, any reason why it shouldn't be try and explain differences in human behavior as well.
Right, but because sometimes one criticism that has been raised against behavioral ecologists is that, okay, you explain behavior as an adaptation, but in the case of humans, well, behavior which is sometimes defined as hardwired or instinctive or culturally underdetermined might be adaptive, but adaptive to our environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, which is not the environment in which the majority of humans live. So that might mean that some of our behavior is not adaptive now; it's maladaptive. That is what evolutionary psychologists normally is the argument.
Yeah, they might say that. I mean, behavioral ecology is a framework, right? It's a method that you use to answer your questions, and it's true that, well, okay, there's no such thing as an environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. That is a wrong way of thinking about the world. I mean, evolution is a continuous process. It didn't start somewhere and stop somewhere and that's it. I mean, it doesn't work like that. So forget environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. That's just confusing the situation. But putting that aside, it is also true that evolution takes time to work. And therefore, it's very well known that if environments change very quickly, or environments are just very variable and fluctuating all the time, then that you'll get what's called mismatch. I mean, there's not really enough time. Evolution takes time to work. So one of the causes of a mismatch between a kind of functional hypothesis behavior and what you actually observe people doing might be because the environment suddenly changed, and no one's really arguing that evolution is instant, so people might have no clue what is the best, even if they're being sort of strategic in their decision making, active. They might not even know what is the best thing to do because the environment's just totally new. So no one's got a clue. I mean, no one's denying that. So mismatch is a big thing, and it's probably a big thing in animal behavior too. I mean, there's all these species going extinct because of global warming. The flowers are not flowering at the right time. The rain is not coming at the right time. Blah blah blah. They're going extinct, but and they're doing the wrong thing. They're laying their eggs at the wrong moment, or whatever it is. So mismatch is a thing, and it's a thing in humans too. It might be less of a thing in humans because we can change our behavior quite quickly, partly because we are cultural. So that's a big question, really. I mean, how much of our behavior is adaptive or not? But I think, how can you say something's maladaptive unless you've tried to fit an adaptive model? I mean, what's your definition of maladaptive? You can just assert that it is, if you like, and you might be right. I mean, it's probably not very good to take heroin or some class A drug, and it's probably designed to fire some pleasure pathway in your brain, and it's so successful at doing that it's killing you by making you addictive. No one's claiming that every single thing everybody does is adaptive, but you might want to, if you think that menopause is a maladaptation, you might want to think about why it might be an adaptation before you say that, because if you just want to state that it's a maladaptation, I'm not going to believe you unless you've tried pretty hard to fit a model of think about all the, because one of the reasons, so if you do behavioral ecology, you come up with a model, you think, okay, maybe this is why it evolved. So maybe you model it formally. You could make a verbal model, you know, which might work. Okay, wings look like they're for flying. Seems to work pretty well. But, you know, you might have a more sophisticated model than that, like, you know, menopause evolved because if you stop reproducing, you can have more grandchildren if you help your grandchildren or whatever. Now that is just a verbal model. It's not very specific. If you try and model it specifically, it's quite hard to model actually. And lots of models found it didn't work. Lots of models found it did work. And therefore some people think there's some kind of constraint on your fertility and it's a biological phenomenon. And other people think it's actually an adaptation that does evolve through natural selection. And you know, those two groups can fight it out, and with some theoretical models, some comparative studies, you can do comparisons across species. You can say, okay, which species have menopause, which species don't have menopause. Maybe we can answer it that way. Or we can say, you know, some individuals in the population have menopause, others of them don't, which isn't the case in humans. So that's a bit difficult because everyone has menopause, so we don't really have. So, you know, I'm just saying it's a research framework. You're saying, how did this evolve? And you're asking that question, you know, and trying to test hypotheses in whatever way you can. And we might use formal evolutionary models. And we might look at variation within a population to test our model, like lots of the optimal foraging papers did that. And they might say, you know, women and men might have different foraging strategies because they have different success rate hunting large prey. And you might be able to show that using models, and then you might make a prediction about what men eat and what women eat. And if your model doesn't work, you just follow the scientific process. You say, okay, my model didn't work. So something's wrong. I either got the currency wrong, I got the constraints wrong. One of my assumptions was wrong. So I need to improve my model and try again. And that way the scientific process follows itself. So models are always wrong. They just are. Sometimes, I can't remember who was it who said models are always wrong, but sometimes they're useful. I didn't say somebody famous said that. I can't remember who I'm quoting, but
well, they have to be because they are abstractions. They are abstractions of reality, and as such.
Yeah, a model is just a tool. I mean, all models are wrong. They're just a tool to try and understand what's going on, and they might help you, and they might not.
Right. Well, the example that evolutionary psychologists normally put forward is the example of our sweet tooth. You know, I mean, we like sweet things a lot, and this is very bad for us. This is very bad for our heart and our blood and everything, and we put on weight. And why is it that we have that? Because it's maladaptive now, but it was adaptive in this thing that you think do not exist, the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. You know?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think we didn't really start putting on weight until much more recently than that, I don't think. I mean, the obesity crisis is much more recent than the transition to farming. I think the sweet tooth's been pretty useful until very recently. Now I agree, it's a bit too easy to get hold of chocolate, but I don't think that goes back to hunter-gatherer days. I think that our farming ancestors did not have a problem. And I think if you lose your sense of taste, you get all sorts of problems. Lots of old people practically die of starvation when they lose their sense of taste. So I still doubt it. It's probably a bit of a maladaptation now because we've just made sweet things so easy to get hold of. Right. But that's something that I think has really. But there has been some people think there's been a lot of evolution, like diabetes and that sort of thing. There's some evidence. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I seem to remember reading there's some evidence that, we've adapted to. There's all sorts of evidence of adaptation to a farming diet. Alleles that help us to digest gluten or whatever. Alleles that help us to digest milk, obviously. That's the most famous one. And, you know, those things have only been around about 4,000 years. And alcohol dehydrogenates, you know. I mean, some people think that non-farming populations are particularly susceptible to alcoholism because, well, we all were when we first started making it in large quantities, but some populations have evolved alleles that protect us. I mean, some populations have evolved alleles that protect us from cannibalism and the brain diseases that can result if you eat other people's brains. I mean, there's tons of evidence now of all kinds of genetic adaptations to different subsistence strategies. And some of those subsistence strategies are quite recent. So, I mean, the sort of revolution in genetics is helping us identify a whole load of these genes to do with all sorts of things. And some of them do bring with them risks of things like Alzheimer's that might not have been a problem when most of us were dead by the age of 70. Maybe Alzheimer's wasn't really something you had to worry about. Now that we live to 80, it is, you know, or 90. So there's certainly a mismatch. It's a possibility, but my first reaction to anyone saying anything is maladaptive is to interrogate that a bit and think about, well, why did it evolve in the first place? And, you know, maybe it's not useful now because the environment changed very rapidly, but how rapid is rapidly, I'm not quite sure. Right.
Now, let's now move on to the study of culture. I mean, would you say that the Darwinian approach, can we use a Darwinian approach to talk about cultural evolution? Some people say that cultures evolve, but are not Darwinians. So how would you, what would you take on that?
Yeah, I think it has, I mean, I have written a bit about this. I think there's been a bit of confusion. Some people are using the word cultural evolution quite broadly, just to mean changes in culture over time. In the same way that people used to talk about evolution before Darwin. Lots of people were talking about evolution. They didn't know about natural selection. They just knew that animals changed, that fossils were around that weren't around anymore. So something was changing, but they didn't have Darwin's theory. So I like to think of cultural evolution a bit like that, actually. You know, culture changes over time. And then other people use it specifically to mean a particular kind of way of modeling cultural evolution through these transmission biases. And to me, they're not exactly the same thing. So, for example, behavioral ecology can be used to try and explain cultural evolution in the old sense of the word, but it's not using the sort of population genetics kind of, and it's not necessarily using that approach. So I think you just have to make a distinction between what you mean and I mean, to me, your culture is partly the environment in which you live. So if you are born into a matrilineal population, you might make different decisions from if you were born into a patrilineal population. It's just kind of, it's like the forest you live in, right? It's your culture. And if you're born in a place where there are Buddhist monasteries where you can deposit some of your children, then that's a different environment than if you're born in London, you know. So it's like I think cultural behavior, as I say, I think an evolutionary approach is useful to try and understand how we navigate the culture in which we live. I'm not sure that this population genetics model that is so prevalent within the field, and some of your previous speakers have used extensively, is as useful as we thought it would be. I'm not quite sure. I think we kind of went off the idea of memes and the idea that, the culture are these ideas that go around and infect you and make you do a certain thing. I mean, people sort of went off that idea, but then they carried on talking about cultural variance. So I wasn't really sure, and modeling it in exactly the same way. So I wasn't really sure what had changed really. But I mean, I think that approach might be quite useful for looking at cumulative culture, technological evolution, certain areas. But I'm not sure that it solved as many problems as we thought it might. There was a lot of enthusiasm when people started talking about gene inheritance models and all this kind of thing. And I'm not sure that I know a lot of very complicated population genetics models have been generated. And no, I don't want to make it sound like they didn't contribute anything, but I'm just saying that that's just one way of looking at cultural evolution. Right. And I think I've got a more ecological way of looking at cultural evolution. And I don't know whether I mean, if you're living in a matrilineal society, you might behave in a certain way, like marriage might not be very important, blah, blah, blah. Not because, I mean, and then you can change the environment pretty quickly and people start behaving differently. And maybe marriage will become very important if they, so for example, if you are living in an environment with no cattle and then they start keeping cattle and the whole ecology changes and suddenly wealth inheritance is really important because these cattle are really important and men start controlling this wealth and therefore you want to marry wealthy men because you want to get your hands on some of these cattle because they help you raise your children, you're going to change your whole behavior, right? And your marriage system's going to change and your culture's going to change. And we've actually seen that happening, right? So, and I don't think I didn't come to that conclusion by modeling social transmission of matrilineal. I came to that conclusion by looking at the ecological costs and benefits of matrilineal or patrilineal. So that's just a different way of looking at it. And if you're interested in the question I'm interested in, which is why did that evolve in the cost benefit sense, then maybe the cultural transmission bit can stay kind of a black box because I don't know whether it's strategic decision making or cultural transmission or what it is. I don't really know. But I think it's pretty hard to model behavior from the ground up from transmission mechanisms. I'd rather model it from the top down and look at how evolution, shaped behavior. That's kind of, to me, that seems a more logical. Well, I don't know, it's more logical. It's just a different way of doing it, and then that's the way I do it, and I think that helps me understand what's going on. Right. And I don't think trying to think about who taught you to be matrilineal is going to help me very much. Yeah. I'm not interested in that. I mean, I know psychologists are really interested in that, but it's not what I do. I'm just saying kind of the way I look at it, As I say, I always keep going back to Tim Bergen's 4 questions. I just put them in different boxes, and that the box that I'm in isn't thinking too much about transmission biases, even though that has been a really big part of the field for the last 20 years or so. Yeah. I don't know. I think psychologists have been studying that forever and it's just proved incredibly difficult to study. And I'm not sure the cultural evolution people are going to be much more successful than psychologists were in trying to work that all out. Yeah. It's such a minefield. So but you don't need to answer the questions that I've been trying to answer. Yeah. So you would be critical of the so-called dual inheritance. I'm not critical of it. I'm just. Oh, right. I mean, all models are wrong, and some are useful, and it's quite useful. And I think it's going to be more useful now that we've got more kind of ancient DNA, and we can look at these big-scale changes in genome frequencies and all that sort of thing. I think it might come back into its own actually, but I think it went through a phase of going into a lot of models that had rather forgotten about the genes and a bit lost their lost their usefulness to me to understand what was going on. As I know, I'm not critical of it. I'm just saying I don't think it's as useful as people thought it was going to be. I mean, all models are wrong. They're just tools to try and understand the world. And I don't really. I think of your culture as your ecology more than a meme that's trying to get into your brain and make you do something stupid. Yeah. But, I might be wrong. And there may be examples of some behaviors that fit that model much better than the kind of behavioral approach.
Right. Well, but the first thing we have to see is to look at the behavior we want to explain.
Exactly.
What model fits better to that behavior, let's say.
Exactly. I mean, when we were looking at phylogenetics, I think some cultural behaviors show quite a strong phylogenetic signal. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if your listeners know what phylogenetics is, but it's it's another tool taken straight from biology, trying to kind of infer. If you assume that there was a family tree of evolution, which we're pretty sure there is across species, and there might be a bit of hybridization here and there, but if the overwhelming pattern is tree-like, then you can try and infer that tree from diversity in the present. So we can get kind of window into the past by looking at variability across the present using statistics. And evolutionary biologists have been doing that to understand the evolution of animal species and plant species and everything else. It doesn't really normally work within species because by definition everyone's mating with everyone, so you don't get a tree. But because humans are quite cultural, some of us have argued that languages show very tree-like pattern, and that actually language phylogeny is not always, but sometimes are a pretty good record of population history, especially when you've got new groups kind of fanning out over a new area like the Austronesian tree or the Bantu or those are two very famous ones, but there's there's scores of trees now, and therefore you have a kind of tree of cultural history. So we took some of the methods that evolutionary biologists have been applying to try and look at the evolutionary history of species and try to infer statistically to what was going on in the past that led to the present.
Right.
And if you can, anthropology is a bit stuck in the present because behavior kinship doesn't fossilize very well. We don't really know what people were doing 4,000 years ago. And we've kind of argued that you can use that approach in some cases and look at, both the kind of try and guess what ancestral states might have been. And if you can work out ancestral states, you can also try and make some formal hypotheses about co-evolution. So going back to the cows and the matrilineal, we made a tree of Bantu languages. We looked at all the existing Bantu groups, whether they were matrilineal or patrilineal, which most of them were one or the other, broadly. And then we looked at which one of them keep cows and which one of them don't. And then you can just use statistics to say, okay, if this is what our tree looks like, what are the most likely ancestral states in the past that led to the present? So you can use Bayesian statistics to kind of answer that question. And biologists worked all that out because they've been answering the exact same question about the evolution of animal species. And so we just borrowed all their maths, which was all done already. And the linguists had already done all the work for us as well, because they'd already been classifying all these languages and saying that word's cognate with that word and it evolved here and they just changed a V into an F or whatever and it's the same word. So the linguists already had all these great classifications there. So we just put the two together. And then you can ask questions like, did cattle keeping co-evolve with patrilineal kinship? And you can run a billion, now that we have computers, you can run a billion models, literally, of every single possible sequence of cultural evolution that could have happened, and ask which ones are most likely to have given rise to the pattern that we see in the world today in terms of who's keeping cattle and what kinship system they have and how their languages are related. And if you put all that information into the computer, you can estimate a kind of historical model. And you can try a model where keeping cattle and kinship have nothing to do with each other, or you can have a model where keeping cattle and kinship influence each other in the way that our behavioral ecological theories have predicted, and that we predict that cattle keeping is driving a switch to patrilineal kinship. And we can use Bayesian statistics to say which of these two is more likely to have generated the pattern that we see today. And the answer was, it's very much more likely that, so you get lots of switching between matrilineal and patrilineal throughout the tree, all over the place. But when a culture adopts cattle, it's more likely to switch. And when it's got cattle, it's less likely to switch back. And you can estimate all those switching probabilities statistically. So you can then say with a bit more confidence, well, I think that bringing cattle into Africa causally promoted patrilineal kinship. And of course, there were already anthropologists who said this back in 1961 when people talked about the matrilineal belt corresponding with the tsetse fly, where, you know, cattle can't be raised because the tsetse fly kills cattle, basically. And so anthropologists had already noticed this association as a correlation. And this statistical method is trying to put it in a sort of causal model framework and provide evidence that it's not just a chance association, it's actually a causal effect. So you've got this little fly generating a kinship system, basically. So it's a sort of ecological origins of a pattern of kinship in Africa. And that was, we just totally stole methods from evolutionary biology to test that hypothesis more formally. So that's, you know, a nice example of how you can try and, we were sort of stealing the methods developed by evolutionary biologists and the trees developed by linguists and the ideas developed by anthropologists together, and they all fit. In that sense, it doesn't work at all. But going back to your original point, I think kinship systems do show quite strong phylogenetic signals. In other words, they switch around through historical time, but there is some evidence that you're quite likely to do what your ancestors did, and they're quite likely to do what their ancestors did. And that's called phylogenetic signal. In other words, having an ancestor that did that makes it more likely that the descendants did it. But if you look at some other behaviors, like maybe how you play in a cooperative game or something like that, I'm not sure there's very strong phylogenetic signal. So you might not want to, it might not be a useful approach if you're studying something like that, or something that's highly variable within culture is not going to be very, that approach is not going to work. So you want to choose a method that is appropriate to whatever question you're asking, really. But like kinship patterns and marriage patterns seem to show some phylogenetic signal, which you know, it might be because they're kind of a bit frequency dependent. In other words, they're like, if you're in a society, I mean, language is obviously frequency dependent. If you're in a society that speaks a certain language, you want to speak that language, or you're going to be at a massive disadvantage. And so if you marry into a new society, your children are just going to learn, you know, the language of that society. So even if it's not your language, because they need to speak the language their peers are speaking, which is why these languages make nice trees, because even though there's lots of interbreeding going on, the marriage is the language is quite frequency dependent. And marriage systems and kinship systems might be a bit similar to that. Like if there's a rule that, you don't marry your cousin, or you do marry your cousin, or whatever the rule is, you can't really strike out on your own very successfully. It's better to do what everyone else is doing, or you're going to get into trouble. So, you can't. It's not that these systems can't change, and they do change when you really change the environment in some way. But things that are frequency dependent might show a much stronger phylogenetic signal, and therefore be much more amenable to this kind of analysis.
Because when you say phylogenetic signal, you mean that we have the kinship system of our ancestors?
Yes, I just mean that sort of where you are on the phylogeny helps predict your kinship system to some extent. Whereas if kinship was just completely randomly distributed over every node and every branch of the tree, then the tree is not really giving you much information. So we probably, in other words, it doesn't really have much history. It doesn't have much kind of legacy. So there's no point really there may not be much point in using a phylogenetic approach if you're looking at highly labile behavior that is just changing all the time. But something like language shows strong phylogenetic signal, because the language you speak definitely shows some sort of ancestor-descendant relationship with what your ancestors spoke, and therefore gives some idea of your history. So, so biologists came up with this word phylogenetic signal. So, if a trait is just not predicted in any way by phylogeny, then there is no signal. Like I mean, we did a study of witchcraft using the Bantu language tree, and there wasn't, to be honest, there wasn't much. There was a bit. There were a few things. There were a few ideas that looked quite ancestral to do with poison being a removable part of witchcraft infection or whatever. There were but most traits were just so variable across the tree that the phylogeny didn't really tell you very much about what these people believed and what those people believed, or at least not in the way we were measuring it. So it's not always a very useful way of structuring, the data, but sometimes it is. On the kinship, I think it definitely is. Marriage systems, it is. Language, it is. So a lot of the things that anthropologists have long been classical anthropologists have long been interested in are pretty phylogenetic. And that's not surprising, because anthropology was sort of built on the idea of trying to understand cultural difference. So they obviously picked on those things that are quite variable across cultures, but also show patterns.
Right. Let me go back to this distinction in that classical in the anthropology of kinship between matrilineal and patrilineal. I mean, you draw this correlation between patrilineal and cattle raising. But how would you explain from an evolutionary point of view the actual existence of these two descent systems?
Well, I think
societies are matrilineal and...
Yeah, I mean, I think... Okay, so a patrilineal society, you have property tends to be... It's a cluster of things. It tends to be property is passed down to your sons and not to your daughters. Your name and your titles, your land, your cattle tend to go more to your sons than they do to your daughters. So why would you do that? Well, one hypothesis is just that. So cattle are like this super valuable thing, right? Which, if you're a farmer, it's backbreaking work. And it used to be, I think, in Africa, that land was not really the limiting resource. So you could say, hey, look, I've got all this land, come and marry me. And no one's interested, because the only crop you get is the number of hours you spend hoeing, weeding, fighting off elephants, all that kind of stuff. and therefore men don't really have anything to offer. So women just organise their lives, and men help them or not, and whatever. Whereas if you've got cattle, hey, that's a lot less work. You just have to go and milk them. You've got all these amazing calories, all this amazing protein. The trouble is, everyone's trying to steal your cattle, and men are busy defending them.
Mm-hmm.
And because they have to, because they're walking money, right? They're really valuable. And if you manage to build up a huge herd of cattle, then you're going to be a very desirable husband. So you might be able to accumulate lots of wives and girlfriends and whatever, and therefore your reproductive success is going to be much higher than someone who only has a very small herd of cattle, or a poor old hunter-gatherer who doesn't have any, who's going to go extinct, because everyone's going to vote with their feet and go for the rich guy. Therefore, if you're a parent, male or female, you're going to leave your cows to your son, because it's going to make a massive difference to his reproductive success. But you're not going to leave them. I mean, your daughter will benefit from them to some extent, but her reproductive rate is not really limited by, how many husbands she can attract. It's more limited by her biology, right? So, whereas for men, so you often get polygyny, patriarchy, some biased inheritance. They often come together as a package. So, I mean, that's one hypothesis, which I think is correct. But I also think, there's also been some quite interesting models more recently on the role of warfare as well. So the other problem that you have is so let's say you've got men hanging on to all these valuable resources. So let's say that Engels or whatever is right. And once you've got private property, men try and grab onto it, and therefore the women kind of vote with their feet and go for the resources, because they just want, as many resources as possible to feed their children. And then what can men start also competing with each other, like brothers start competing with each other. So then what do you do? Because you've got, and what, one of the things you might do is go to war and try and get more land, more resources. And there have been some quite interesting models showing that, that's one way of sort of relieving competition at home.
Right.
So people at home are very much in favour of that. So if their son's going to go off and fight and get some more territory, or even if he's not, even if he's just going to leave and find a wife elsewhere and find a new farm elsewhere, you're going to support him in that, because it's going to relieve competition at home. So I think warfare is also playing a bit of a role here. Men and women, again, are pretty supportive of warriors. Yes. Relieve competition at home. Go and grab some new territory, please. That would be very useful. Don't compete with us. That's always been very popular at home. Like, off you go. So I think some people think that, I actually think that, so I think patriarchy is a bit of both. It's kind of, it's the asymmetry and the payoffs to the marriage system once you have heritable wealth is really useful. And then I think warfare is probably also playing a role in this, because you don't really get, Alberto Micheletti wrote this nice paper where he talks about boys' clubs and girls' clubs, where the boys' clubs are where the men are, everyone's favouring men when the men are going off and fighting for new resources. And it's a completely symmetrical model, that if you would get girls' clubs if the women were all going off and fighting for resources. Yeah. That doesn't happen very much. So you don't get girls' clubs very often. Maybe Celtic Britain had one or two or something. But these things are not completely deterministic. Just going right back to the cattle and patrilineal. When we did our phylogenetic tree, there's all possible combinations do exist.
Right.
You've got Himba, who are matrilineal, and they keep cattle.
Right.
So there are some examples of every combination of cattle, matrilineal, no cattle, matrilineal, no cattle, patrilineal, cattle, patrilineal. All four boxes are full. Right. It's just that you're statistically much more likely to be patrilineal.
You see patterns, yeah.
Yeah, but there are always some exceptions to prove the rule. Yeah.
Right.
The Himba being one. Yeah,
Right.
and they're all pretty warlike, mind you, because you can't hang on to cattle if you're not prepared to fight for them. So yeah, and that's also another way of getting more cattle. Send your sons out and kill someone else and steal
That's
theirs. Yeah.
That's right.
So there might be lots of reasons why you big up your son, whether you're male or female.
Yeah.
He might be pretty useful. Resources. He might make pretty good use of those resources. But yeah.
Right. Now, let me ask you about one last topic that you have done research as well, which is human demography and fertility. And one of the most surprising things of the evolution of demography, especially in our society, is the low fertility that we find in Western societies, and specifically fertility below the replacement level. And this seems to contradict the Darwinian model, because it seems that the wealthier you get, the less children you have, and sometimes so few children that you are below the replacement level. So how would you explain this?
Yeah, I mean that is you're right that it's always very annoying to end my course of teaching the evolution of human behaviour with this example from our own society that doesn't seem to work very well. You know, it's always very frustrating to have to end with something that doesn't really work. I mean, evolution anthropologists tend to look at low fertility in terms of high parental investment. So when you have conditions where competition is heating up and a strategy of having large numbers of uneducated children is not really working anymore, and that you need to have highly educated children who can compete for these very unequally distributed resources, which are becoming more and more difficult to get your hands on if you're a young person, then you need to invest heavily in your offspring. So that's the kind of quantity trade-off idea. I mean, I can't remember if that phrase came from economics or biology, but anyway, it doesn't really. It sounds a bit rude applied to human beings, but it's a sort of phenomenon that we're talking about. And I have used the phrase "runaway parental investment" in that I wonder if, like, when you see, like, it's almost like parents are sort of massively over-investing. It's like parenting has become so costly and so intensive and so difficult to combine with earning money that after having about two, people are just exhausted, and also by the time they got educated, they're so old that they haven't got time to have more than about two anyway, even if they want to. And so that we're now investing at such a high level that having 8 is practically impossible, and having 2 is as far as most of us get. So you could say that, and some people have argued, well, there's, people are having 8 still doing better. So, I mean, it could be a mismatch, like, the environment's just changed very rapidly. And, I mean, having said that, there are examples in history of runaway parental investment in things like dowry inflation and this sort of thing, because I did some stuff on monasteries, and, people are packed off to monasteries because of dowry inflation got so high. But I think another very interesting thing that's been happening very recently with the latest fertility collapse is, so it went down a lot over the last 200 years in farming populations in France and England to start with, and then spread all over the world really, and has now started literally since about 2000, literally everywhere in the world has been reduced fertility at different rates. But I mean, in Asia and monogamous places like Asia and Europe, it's getting very, very low, and parental investment is getting very, very high. But one quite interesting trend that is happening just recently is that the wealth relationships, I think, are switching back. So it used to be that the wealthy people sort of went into the demographic transition first. They were educating their children more. They were worried about not dividing their farms up into too small bits, so they were limiting their fertility, and they were investing more heavily in each child. And wealthy people were doing that, and poor people were just more kind of like following a strategy of, well, okay, life may be tough, but we'll just have lots of children and hope some of them make it. And that pattern has been pretty solid. And then it sort of flattened out, so there was no effect between wealth and fertility at all.
Right.
And now it's beginning to go positive again. So the big drop in fertility most recently in places like Europe is that the poor and the less well-educated are not getting married and not having children.
All right.
So the middle classes and the university educated are still managing to get a job, managing to buy a house and having 2 children, which is what they've been doing for a while. And and again, I'm just talking statistically here, and the less well educated and the lower earners are finding it more difficult to find a long-term partner. They're less likely to get married.
Right.
They're less likely to have children. And so it's almost like it's sort of taken 20 or 30 years, but the behavioral ecological models are almost kind of, for the wrong reasons, really, coming back in. And that it does seem, I mean, another interesting thing I think that's happening is this has probably been, I think, men with low income and low job prospects have had lower reproductive success for quite a while, but now that effect is affecting both men and women. So women with low job prospects and low income are now finding it very hard to find partners and are not having children, long-term partners. So I don't know exactly what's going on, but the wealth relationship kind of went away in Europe, and now it's re-establishing it. There's signs that there's just these massive economic barriers into marriage and reproduction now, which lots of people are, for whatever reason, not. So actually, I've got interested in this topic again. I sort of, like lots of evolutionary anthropologists, I wrote stuff back in sort of 2008. I was writing stuff about runaway parental investment and things like that. And then I kind of thought, maybe it doesn't work, or maybe there's nothing more to say. And now I've got interested again because actually something's changing. I mean, first of all, fertility is still going down. And second of all, those paradoxical relationships seem to be reversing now. So, and actually we did some stuff in Addis Ababa way back with one of my PhD students, Ishetu Gormuna. I remember way back in 2002, we argued that, I mean, there's a lot of extreme poverty in Addis Ababa, but it's also extremely easy it was even then quite easy to not get pregnant or terminate a pregnancy if you didn't want to. And so Addis Ababa had incredibly low fertility, and it was lowest among the poor, and it was only the wealthy who were like having babies. And I think that pattern is now spread to a lot of places. So yes, it's a bit of a paradox. And it's still a paradox. I'm not saying it's solved everything, but there's kind of there's enough changing in there to make me quite interested in having another look at this. Yeah.
Now, Ruth, we have to leave it here.
Okay.
That's all we had time for. It has been a pleasure and a privilege to have this conversation with you.
Well, it's been fun.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. It was fun. Yeah.
And thanks to Mace for her technical assistance, and thank you all for watching.